All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. And welcome back, especially Sharon Fight and Jessica Enyart. Sharon is a registered dietitian specializing in pediatric dietary needs who works for Holly Ridge. And she was our guest back in February when we were talking about what kids should be eating and how much and how you should present it. And then Jessica Enyart is our an occupational therapist who works for Holly Ridge as well, and with their birth to 3 clients. And last month we had a lot of fun talking about how to present food to make it fun and interesting for kids. And we have a new guest speaker as well. This is Barbara Coven Ellis. Thanks, Barbara. Barbara is a new employee of the Aubin Aphasia Speech and Language Center, and she is also a nationally known feeding therapist. She problem solves feeding issues for other clinicians and families, and she's worked with children in the NICU as well as through their teenage years. And she's presented a few times to feeding professionals throughout the country through podcasts and various other opportunities. So we're so grateful to have all of you here today because we have an amazing panel together. So thank you so much for joining us. We are going to be addressing the topic today of I followed the plans, I presented the foods, but my child still won't eat. I think we've all been there in that moment where you're like, oh my gosh. Why is this still happening? Yeah. So getting down to the bottom of reasons for food refusals. And that is so frustrating when you think you've done everything that you were supposed to do and your child is like, nope, not gonna do it. So we will be recording this session and broadcasting it again at 3:30 today if you weren't able to attend it live at 12:30. So if you're watching our rebroadcast this afternoon, just know that you can always leave a comment for us in the chat, and we are happy to get back to you. So if you have questions that we weren't able to answer because you weren't live, just put it in the chat. Know that we actually do read those things, and we actually care about your questions, and we will get back to you. So we also are going to put a few links of some resources into the chat for you as well. One of those resources that will be in the chat is it's a link to Learn the Signs, Act Early from the CDC website. And so there's some free materials there. Jessica, can you just talk a little bit about why it's so early to learn the signs and act early when there's a feeding issue on the table?
Well, just from my personal experience and just what I do know around feeding and oromotor development, we know that the earlier that we address something, the easier it is for the children to adapt when we start to intervene. And really for babies, they have that reflex at birth that allows them to suck and actually feed because it's something that is for survival. But as they grow and change and they develop and they hit a certain point, that reflex integrates and it sort of dissipates. And then we are expecting them to be able to feed on their own. And so if we have difficulties at that point and they don't transition well, then it's something that they don't inherently want to do all the time, and they don't know they need to do it for survival. And that mechanism that kind of helps them know to do that is now gone. And so feeding can then become something that they can choose not to do if they don't like the experience around it. And that just becomes a real big problem, because if we don't have food, we don't have nutritional needs met, and then we have other things that just cascade from there. So the earlier we can get in and just address it and figure out the problems, or even just problem solve what is happening, the faster we can address this before it becomes a bigger issue, I think.
That's awesome. Barbara, you've had a lot of experience in working with babies and kids and even teenagers that have had feeding issues. What has your experience been as far as the timeline for resolving these things? Like, what should parents expect if it's not going well? Is it easier to resolve the earlier you get started, or is it the same or just depends?
No, it's much. The timeline is generally much shorter when you start early, but it's very personal because it depends on why they're seeing me in the first place. Somebody who's a NICU grad who was born at 28 weeks is going to have a different kind of outcome than somebody who was, born at full term and has a tongue tie. So, everybody's different, but definitely if we're starting earlier, we're going to have probably less time. And not only that, but easier outcomes for everybody because it hasn't so negatively impact the whole family unit during that time. I mean, when kids get to me at 4, that's 4 years that the family's been having a really tough time making sure this kid gets fed.
Yeah, that's true. That's a long time. My goodness. So Sharon, when you are working with a family like that who's been struggling with, food and diet for a long time, what kind of effect does that have on the whole family dynamic?
Oh, I think it can have a major effect. And, parents sometimes at that point have just given up and just give the child what they think the child will eat because they become tired and they don't, they want to try to have a positive mealtime, but they can't if they offer something new to their child and the child really reacts in a negative way. If there are other children, what's going on. Sometimes families don't even eat together by that point. So I would agree certainly with Jessica and Barbara that if parents feel like something's not going well, they should speak up. And if the first person they speak to doesn't hear them, especially if their child's less than 3, there's an early intervention center around someplace or that they can go and talk to someone and see if an assessment is appropriate. And certainly if it's a baby, I just wanted to mention, we had talked about this a little bit earlier, is if there's a baby that's born early, there's some trauma around that with the baby and the family. And then if feeding continues and is not going well, that continues. So it's really important, I think, to not only focus on the child, but sometimes step back and say to the parents, how are you feeling? How are you feeling about what's going on? Do you need some help too, in addition to working with the child and the family as a whole? So lots of parts when there's feeding issues going on. And it's really important to try to look at all of those parts.
Jessica, I would add to that because she said the EI programs, feeding matters. And there are such a wonderful resource. And the nice thing about it too is they have a page that's all about red flags and when you should talk to somebody. And the nice thing about it is you can print it out and you can fill it out and bring it to your pediatrician and go, look, these people know what they're talking about, and this is my kid.
So do we have a link for Feeding Matters that we can put in the chat or put up on the screen?
Well, actually, I think the little card that we keep talking about is actually from Feeding Matters.
The ICFQ rack card?
Yes. But I agree with Barbara. If you just go search for Feeding Matters and pull that up, it is a great tool for families to use. And I agree, yes, fill that out and take it to your physician and take it to these other people and say, here, you might not be able to put it in words as a parent, but this will help you put it in some words and on paper. So,
normally we would share this on the screen with our viewers right now so they could see the questionnaire and know what's on it. And unfortunately, Alyssa let me know that this PDF file is too big. So we can't share it with our readers, but if you click on the link, you'll be able to open it up and we can just go over the questions that are in them. It just has 6 questions on the Feeding Matters questionnaire. And those questions are, does your baby or child let you know when they're hungry? These are all yes, no. Well, not all yes, no. Do you think your baby child eats enough? How many minutes does it usually take to feed your baby or child? It's either less than 5, 5 to 30 minutes or greater than 30 minutes? Do you have anything special to help your baby or child eat? Do you have to do anything special at all? Change the food, change the lighting, change the plates, puree your food. Does your baby child let you know when he is full? And based on the questions above, do you have concerns about your baby or child's feeding? Those are the 6 questions in the questionnaire that we sadly can't share with all of you, but click on the link, you can get it. So, Barbara, why are those questionnaires so, why is this such a great resource? You said you were raving about feeding resources.
Well, Feeding Matters, there's a brand new diagnosis that came out last year, pediatric feeding disorder, which means we now have a specific diagnosis that covers all of our kids from birth to adulthood, and all of the variety of reasons that they might not be eating. And Feeding Matters was behind all of that, getting that legislation going through, which tells you what kind of group they are. And when it comes to families and things, they are a huge, huge resource because they actually have a program where families that have a history of having kids that have problems will work alongside to help other families. It's a mentoring program.
Cool.
Especially for kids that are tubey kids or kids with severe aversions. And I've had several families here in the Pacific Northwest that have reached out to Feeding Matters and gotten paired up and have found so much help and support by having another family to talk to.
Yeah.
So I personally have seen how wonderfully that can work.
Oh my gosh, that's great that they have that set up for families, because sometimes when your child has a feeding tube or has something unexpected going on like that, you feel like you're all alone on the planet, and it's nice.
Unfortunately, there's some really scary information out on social media about these things, and very inaccurate information. So to have something that where it's reliable and it's based with people that are doctors and nutritionists and therapists like us, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I can see Jessica and Sharon just nodding their heads here in agreement. So there must be a lot of fables out there about eating. And Jessica, can you talk about some of the myths or fables around eating? And
yeah, absolutely. And I did want to say just real quick, I think what Barbara mentioned and just Feeding Matters in general is that there's so much, and again, Sharon also touched on this, there's sometimes when these kids have these long standing feeding issues that go on for a really long time, or even just when they're infants, and it creates a lot of stress and a lot of emotional distress for these families. And I mean, I feel like we all know that when you talk to a parent and you say, what do you want your child to do? They all want them to eat and talk and walk. And those are 3 really big ones. And so when feeding and around meals is difficult, it just creates a stressor on the entire family. It makes it really difficult. And I think it's good that we really acknowledge that, because that comes with, it's just as difficult for families. And so when we have support systems and we have places to go and talk to others, even just to feel heard or to feel like somebody gets it, somebody understands where we're at. And then I think it was really important what Sharon said, that just checking in with them and saying, are you okay? Where are you at? Can I support you as a parent, as a sibling? Can I help you just feel okay? And again, that sometimes that is demythifying things for them and taking away some of these thoughts. And I think one of the biggest ahas for me coming into this therapy world was, you hear people say all the time, oh, don't worry about it. They'll figure it out. They'll eat eventually. They won't kill them. They won't starve themselves to death. And I think what I was trying to touch on earlier is that at that point where that reflex dissipates and integrates into the brain, and then they now have to do this thing on their own, they really can. They can starve themselves because they don't know that they have to eat to live. They don't have that maturity and that understanding of their body, and they're just babies. We're talking about a 1-year-old at some points that don't know that they have to eat to survive. And enforcing food is so difficult. It's so hard. And then it becomes this emotional, distressful thing for the child. And it just cascades into so many other things. And it just becomes a negative experience for them. And it just sets the bar for the future for them. And it's just really hard. So that's a big myth. I think that people don't think that kids can really hurt themselves by not eating enough. And so, not that we want to scare parents into thinking that, they're not going to eat for a couple of days and they might pass away that quickly. But it's definitely important to note that we really shouldn't be doing these extreme timeframes where they're not eating. And there is a point when they need to see a professional if that's happening. So I think definitely having that information available so that it's accurate. And then, I'm not sure what other big myths are out there. I think that a lot of times people just say things like, oh, they'll get over it. They'll eventually, figure it out, or they'll just keep feeding that, just keep make them eat it. Tell them they can't get down until they eat it. There's this forcing and this putting, and I think we talked a lot about this last time, Jessica, about the pressure that parents or that people place on their children to eat. And that just creates a whole nother level of emotional distress for them. And it just makes the problem bigger sometimes. So that's what I've got to say.
Well, I know, Sharon, we talked at length too about how important it is. How you present the food is just as important as what you're presenting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, definitely. And I actually want to kind of circle back to what Jessica said and add a few more things. Yeah, that concept, if they were hungry, they will eat. Well, for some children, that doesn't happen. And I think she really said that. But also when I think about children that are older, and maybe they've developed some sensory issues, maybe they have a diagnosis and they start eliminating foods they're not going to eat because there's something else going on. So Barbara mentioned this, feeding matters, and we have this new definition of pediatric feeding disorders. And one of the parts of that definition is something lasts more than 2 weeks. So all children go on food jags. They eat a lot. When I spoke, they eat a lot one day, maybe not so much, but they kind of have this pattern, and it goes, and nothing's lasting for more than 2 weeks, and they're growing fine. That's very different than something that is just ongoing and never changes. So I think, parents, kids vary, you vary day to day what you eat, but think about that if it's just this ongoing problem. And definitely no clean the plate club, no forcing to eat, that type of thing. We found that just backfires. And especially if a child has something going on, whether it's the young baby or an older child, forcing them just makes it, by the time if the family eventually comes in for some help, can extend the time that we might need to work with them, because we have to gain the child's trust back that feeding and eating is safe and pleasurable and not something that they're forced to do. So we certainly want a positive mealtime environment. And if you aren't having joy at mealtime, it might be time to sit down and think about what is going on. Is there something else going on I don't understand? And maybe start a conversation with someone. So
a lot of those refusals come down to having medically complex things going on that a lot of us don't know much about.
That is a good segue to my next question, Barbara. So what are some of the reasons for food refusals? Like, what are some of the medical reasons why a child might not enjoy eating or might not want to eat?
Well, I like to start. Okay, let's start with kids that are already transitioning to solids. Babies and bottles, that's almost a completely different section. But if we're talking about kids and solids, I like to start at the front of the mouth, okay? Very beginning, eating, mouth, chewing. One of the things we oftentimes see is that kids will only eat particular textures, or they chew and chew and chew and chew and chew and chew and chew, and then finally swallow, or sometimes even spit it out, or they pocket it. And I had one kid that pocketed it and would then go into his parents' closet and spit out his lunch. Great thing. So if we start the process with the mouth, and we see that something seems to be off there, because let's face it, we got to chew our food, but it shouldn't take that long. Open up the mouth. One of the first things we oftentimes see is a thing called kissing tonsils. Kid may not be complaining about the fact that their throat is sore, because it might not be. It may be that they have chronic allergies, they have reflux that is undiagnosed, and their tonsils are huge. Kissing tonsils actually come together. Now, if a kid is chewing, you look back there and you see these marbles in the back of the throat. They may not be able to move that solid through just by swallowing. And so they won't do it anymore. They'll try, they'll go, oh my gosh, that looks so good. And then they'll modify things by taking little itsy bitsy mouse bites, or they'll chew it until they can get it down, or they'll take a sip of water to try to wash it down. All of those are red flags that probably something else is going on. And that's the first place I like to look.
That's really a good tip yeah.
That's really an easy one to see. Everybody can see that.
Well, if you know to look for it.
Exactly.
If you know to look for it. And then how do you usually like to resolve that issue? How do you like to handling that situation? So
when I have a kid who comes in and I look in their mouth and I see those big ones, the first thing I'll say to mom is, hey, are you aware? And if I can get them to see, and then we'll talk about it. I just had a kid the other day who came in, and mom said, every time somebody looks in his mouth, they say, this kid's got huge tonsils. But nobody ever considered, telling me what to do about it, or if I needed to do something about it. And since there were no complaints and the kid stays pretty healthy, they weren't worried.
Yeah.
However, they were talking to me. The reason they were talking to me was because of texture difficulties. This kid cannot move on to harder textures, things that don't break down when they're chewing them. Yeah. And they can't move them through those marbles. So I said, well, we need to go back to your pediatrician and maybe even to an ENT and try to figure out why these tonsils are doing what they're doing. Do we have an allergy that's happening? Do we have reflux? Let's try to manage it that way, and then we'll go from there.
Oh, so you just implied that tonsils don't always have to be removed.
Oh, no.
If they're big.
Oh, no. Tonsils are there for a reason. Tonsils are there. They're our first defenses against the things that are trying to get the bacteria and viruses that are trying to get down our throat to make us sick. So we want them if we can keep them. But if they're fighting us too much, that's the time at which, an ENT has to make some decisions. But those are decisions that we make with a pediatrician and an ENT. They're not something that we decide. And that's for the family and their doctors to decide.
The medical team. That's really good advice. Yeah, Jessica, I can see you're nodding away. People have come across this a few times.
Yeah, and I think that Barbara touched on it a little bit, and with in early intervention, I think we see it a lot. Is we see infants and small children that have reflux, and it is more common, I think, than people assume. And when a lot of times we don't even know that's happening. I mean, the babies will still eat, they'll still engage, but they lose a lot of it. They spit a lot of it back up. They just don't maybe have a great experience with feeding. And a lot of times we see it in their posture. We see them fighting this feeling in their stomach and in their throat by arching and pushing back and really doing a lot of extension, what we would kind of refer to it as that. And, it's those babies that are just hard to feed. They don't find a comfortable position. And then when that's not addressed, that can lead to delays in development, because babies will find a place that's comfortable to eat, and they'll find a place that's comfortable after eating that doesn't create pain or discomfort. And that looks like really them holding postures and not doing a lot of movement. And so
maybe skipping out on tummy time, which is so important.
Yes, because being on your tummy isn't comfortable when you feel like things are going to come back up, or if you're just that pressure on the tummy, there's a lot of things that they can avoid. A lot of times they'll just be comfortable laying on their back in a nice recline, and people don't always see that as an issue. They're like, oh, they're comfortable, they like it there, they can sit there for a really long time and be content. And it's not always bad, but it can definitely be something that goes unnoticed. And I think it does happen a lot more than we even acknowledge. So,
this is true for adult clients too. They have statistics: 50% of the population over 50 has reflux, 60% over 60, 70% over 70, right up. And so it's a thing, and a lot of people don't recognize they have it. So when you have a baby or a toddler who you think reflux might be an issue for, what are the telltale symptoms? Like, what are you looking for there? Because like you said, they certainly don't have a vocabulary for it. And so it leaves up to us to be good detectives. What are we looking for?
Well, Jessica's absolutely right with the posturing. The posturing is one of the big ways we know. The other way is looking at somebody's throat, and are they really snotty? Babies that have reflux have a lot of phlegm and a lot of goo. And the reason they have that is because the body produces more secretions, more spit, more mucus to try to line and coat the throat and the esophagus to keep those tissues from being inflamed and sore. And it also helps move things through those areas more easily. So that's another great way of, oftentimes people think they're allergies, and it's not. It's the refluxed material that's causing all of that snot.
Wow. How about that? All right, so we've got reflux, and we've got giant tonsil. What would be another reason why your child might not want to eat?
Well, paired with those tonsils, believe it or not, are the adenoids, which we've all heard about, but we never really think about so much because we don't see them. Mm-hmm. But an adenoid makes a difference. If an adenoid is really big and oversized, what it does is it blocks the soft palate and the ability for air to go in and out through our nose. Okay. Mm-hmm. So if that occurs, anybody who's a speech pathologist will tell you that every time you swallow, you hold your breath. And you can check that yourself just by drinking and drinking and drinking and drinking and seeing what happens. Pretty soon you go, I got to breathe, right? So if you have to hold your breath every time you swallow, and you can't breathe when your mouth is closed chewing, you're going to say, no, I'm going to move to liquids because those I can swallow and then I can breathe, and then I can swallow and then I can breathe. Liquids and purees and things like that. If you think about it as grown-ups, when we're really sick, when we have a really bad head cold, what do we eat? We eat really easy to swallow foods. We eat soups, things like that. We don't go out for the steak, and there's a reason for that. It's because you can't chew and breathe at the same time unless you want to chew like your 3-year-old with their mouth open. And there's a red flag right there.
Knife and fork.
There's a red flag right there. A kid who cannot transition as they get older to chewing with their mouth closed. We don't need it to be closed when they're going up to 3 years old. But after that, if a kid cannot chew with their mouth closed because they can't breathe, then there's a problem. Something's going on up here. That's
another good one to look for. Man, you guys are full of all kinds of things. So what's going on with, I know this is less common, but what are some reasons why a kid might end up with a feeding tube?
Well, kids end up with feeding tubes for a variety of reasons. Generally, they end up with a feeding tube because either they have chronic aspiration, which means that the food, instead of heading towards our bellies, is getting into our lungs. And our lungs weren't meant to manage foods and liquids. That's not what they're meant to do. And basically, we drown ourselves when we do that. So if we've got a really bad problem with aspiration, that might be a reason for a feeding tube. Another reason for a feeding tube is because we've got what has always been in the past referred to as failure to thrive. That is a baby that's not gaining and growing the way we want and need them to for health, for good health. And in those cases, we need that tube to give the nutrition and hydration and oftentimes the medication that these kids need to grow and be stable. And then, one of the top pediatric feeding specialists out there, Catherine Shaker, talks about feeding tubes as actually being a gift. And I know they're so hard. They're so hard for families. And when I transition people from being an oral feeder to a feeding tube, we always go through a couple of months of grieving usually. But what happens once they see the kids starting to thrive, and they start really understanding the gift. And it's a gift to us too, because what it does is it takes all that pressure off for getting things in the mouth, right? Getting that nutrition in, getting the medications in, getting all of that hydration in. And instead, what we've got going on is it being taken care of here, and we can just work on pleasure here and creating a positive relationship with food and with our caregivers and food. So it can be something that everybody has this positive, wonderful relationship starting.
Yeah. Sharon, it sounds like
I wanted to say a couple of things too, and I definitely would agree with Barbara. It can sometimes buy some time so the child can mature a bit and maybe lessen aspiration or lessen other kinds of issues, and you can have that more relaxed approach. Sometimes children just oral motor wise are just things are not working well, so we need to work with that for a period of time. So some feeding tubes we see would just be for a short period of time. Other times, so I've also worked with some older children with conditions like cerebral palsy or even cystic fibrosis, where in the cerebral palsy, it just takes so long to eat. They can eat by mouth, but it takes so long. They cannot get enough energy and nutrients in, and they don't want to spend 6 hours a day eating. They want to go to school. They might want to go do some other activities and things like that. So a feeding tube can be a support in addition to oral feeding. And the same thing would be cystic fibrosis. If there's lots of energy, sometimes a feeding tube at night would just provide that extra energy and nutrition. And these are individuals that are older. And, feeding tubes, I even worked with someone in her 40s that had a cerebral palsy, and she had a feeding tube, and she did eat orally. And, lots of times now, as appropriate, this would not be appropriate for an infant, but older children, you can, blend the food that's being served at home so the child is still participating in mealtime, or the adult, in this case for this adult, she wanted to use, home blended foods versus using formula or combination. There's a whole continuum of how you can nourish an individual child, adult, through a feeding tube if they need one. So
Sharon,
it's not an end, it's the beginning.
Tell us a little bit more about the difference between, a lot of feeding tubes, there's a bag of formula that gets attached and it just drips in. But tell us a little bit about blended, when you make your own food and put it in your feeding tube. How does that work? What is that?
Wonderful.
Yes. and there's more research going on all the time. Sort of, some feel, and we need to do a little bit more work to really verify this, that if children have been reluctant eaters, sometimes if they start to have some real food as appropriate through the feeding tube, that we all kind of burp things up. I'm not talking about reflux per se. I'm talking about, and just like, oh, this is a different kind of flavor. It's not so negative or whatever that might be. Typically, it would be for what's called a bolus feeding, not a drip feeding, because there's all these things about size of tube and the pump and what can go through and all this kind of thing. But a bolus feeding where you would sit down and the child could have it as like mealtime. If they're sitting around the table with their family, maybe they can eat a little bit orally, maybe not, but they can eat at the very same time that the family is eating. And home blending, there are some techniques, I can't go into it completely about how to blend food, but there's lots of little guides now that families can even use to kind of put together the menu. We still want a child nourished. I sometimes feel you can really, through your home blended tube feeding, nourish your child better than maybe your toddler's eating. The toddler's going to be up and down, but I'm saying most of us can eat well, but you can do that. But again, I want to emphasize that if you have a tube feeding, there is a continuum, and sometimes you might use a formula, and sometimes you might want to use home blended, and there's a combination. Maybe some families want to use a formula one meal a day, but use home blended other times. It's not one or the other, if it's appropriate. And again, we're not talking about young babies here. We're talking about children that would be typically eating. So even though children starting 6-7 months of age, sometimes we do a little bit of baby food if they still have a tube, but that's a really individual decision for each child. As Barbara said earlier, every child is an individual, and that's why we have a team working with them too about it. It's medically appropriate, in terms of oral motor therapy, what's going on at that point. Can we meet their nutrition? I mean, all those players, is it going to work for the family or not? So we need that team working together.
And so that's a great resource on if blending is something you're interested in, and is something that maybe if you've got somebody in your family who is G-tube fed, Children's Hospital of Orange County, CHOC, is an amazing resource for blended foods. They're dietitians there. That's one of their big focuses, and both research-wise and in their patient population, because they have a huge outpatient population and an inpatient feeding group.
That is great to know about. There's a lot to be said for mixing it up then, for not just having the same food or the same nutrients every single time you eat, but actually rotating through a variety of foods, whether it's in a form of a feeding tube or any presentation, right?
Right. And there's also a manual. I'm sorry, I'm not going to think of it. Maybe Barbara, a therapist in Arizona whose name has escaped me, but sometimes you could probably just go home blended tube feedings. There was a manual that was developed by a therapist and a dietitian together, also guidelines. Many children's hospitals, so I'm glad you've had that experience. I know CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia on the East Coast, also has a lot of resources. So a lot of them are really coming and helping families and realize there's not one recipe, there's not one, every family is different, and you work with them as a family where they want to be.
I just wanted to touch really quick and say that I really appreciate the things that Barbara and Sharon both just shared, because I just want to say I don't think that families see a tube as a potential, like you said, gift, Barbara. I think that it can really help kids. And again, Sharon touched on this. We have kids that grow into adults that have CP, and as young adults and or older teenagers, they can often experience food burnout. And it's because they're trying so hard their whole lives to eat and to be part of that crowd and to sit at the table with their friends and have a snack. And it takes not just their energy to do the eating, but their increased tone that they experience throughout their life. All day long, they're burning in excess of calories, and they just literally cannot consume enough to find the balance and make a gain versus, and often they're very thin because of that. And I think that you also talked, Barbara, a little bit about that greening process when they go from oral feeding to tube. But a lot of those older people that have CP experience, it's really a pleasurable thing afterwards, because they still have the ability to eat motor wise, and they can have chips with their friends. They can go to the movie theater and have popcorn. They can do those things that allow them to socially participate, but then they have the majority of their nutrition coming from a different source, and that allows them to still have energy and the ability to engage, but then enjoy that part that they get to eat and just act like and be like everybody else around them. And so it's really actually important to think about that. What is this? Because again, like I said, in the beginning, it's so important for parents that their kids eat, and eating orally is the first thing that we think is the most typical, and that we just really, really strive to have our kids get to that place. And it's great to see a small child with CP be able to eat orally, but then to realize that even if that's something they're doing at 3 and 4 and 5, that doesn't mean that they're going to be able to maintain that through their lifespan. And so it's okay to say they can do it, they like it, they enjoy food, but it's okay to someday look at maybe we need another option as well. Because as they grow and their body changes and those demands increase, it's just really difficult to maintain. So I really liked how you both brought those really important aspects in, so that families don't immediately go to thinking that, oh, my kid needs a tube. Oh, it can be a really great thing that can just bring more pleasure. And like Sharon said, they can sit at the table and enjoy a meal around the same time frame and around the same foods. And again, they can bring some things into their mouth as they're there too. And so they can enjoy that. Social participation is so important for families and for everybody, really.
Yes, absolutely.
That's so wonderful. We're going to have to say goodbye to Barbara in about 4 or 5 minutes here. And so, Barbara, did you have anything else that you wanted to share with families about reasons why your child might not, or things that that would be helpful for them to know about if their child is just flat out refusing to eat food?
Well, one of the my favorite things has to do with looking at GI. Okay. And GI starts at the base of your throat, right? That's the beginning of your esophagus. And kids that feel like something's stuck, we've all been there, right? You know, when you're eating something and you go, oh my gosh, I ate too fast, or that was too big a bite, and it just feels stuck, right? Some kids get that feeling all the time. And so esophageal issues are something that are very real with our kids, especially our kids who are low tone, because our esophagus should be doing this. It's nice little squeeze. It takes the food down, takes it down. And when we've got low tone, it doesn't necessarily do that. And it ends up being just a tube. So gravity is the only thing that's moving the stuff down. So we have to look at the esophagus. And if kids are complaining that things are stuck, or they feel like they're coming back up, that could be esophagus, that could be reflux. We also need to look at constipation. And I know that, people are going, what? Constipation? But
what's that all about?
Whenever I teach people, whenever I teach parents, I talk to them about the fact that your GI tract is just one long tube. It starts here, goes straight down. There are just a few vowels along the way, but other than that, it's one large piece of plumbing. Now, if the lower part of the plumbing gets stopped up, we all know what happens in our own household plumbing, right? Things back up. Well, babies are the same way, and kids are the same way. They feel that fullness, and, unlike you or I, who say, you know what, I got to eat, I got X, Y, Z to go. I don't care that I'm backed up a little, that'll clear up in a day or two. All they know is that they feel awful, and they feel full already. They don't have a hunger drive, and so they don't eat, or they only drink, or they only eat those things that feel very, very comfortable. So anytime we have kids that are limiting the range of foods, that are limiting, like say they don't eat any proteins, they don't eat any animal proteins at all, or they only eat foods that have been blended or really, really mushed up, or they only eat foods that are crunchy and break apart with their teeth. Anytime there's anything that is limited, okay? Now vegetables, that's another thing we have to talk about on a different time. But no crunchy, let's say no crunchy fruits, like no apples and no grapes with skin and all of those kinds of things. Whenever we have those kind of limitations, we have to step back and say, why?
Yeah.
Why? Not, their behavior, what have I done wrong? But instead step back and say, why would this occur? Grapes are yummy. Apples are yummy. Why would this happen? And we can often find a physiological reason. So anytime we're looking at something that, if kids are eating less than 20 foods, I think that they should be talking to their pediatrician. Parents should be talking to their pediatricians about getting some help. And if they're even eating a lot less than 20 foods, they should be getting help very, very soon.
Right.
So variety is super important.
Oh, variety is a huge red flag for us. That tells us right there that you probably need a little extra help.
Is it always a physiological reason why kids don't eat?
Okay. So there is a behavior school of thought. My experience is that almost every behavior comes out of either an experience or a combination of experience and physiology. Okay. A physiological experience, so to speak. Bad kids that are, you know, and I'm saying bad with a big quotations, kids that are stubborn. That's the one I love to hear. Or they just, you know, they want to make me mad. Those are kids that are probably acting out for a reason.
Yeah.
And we have to, just like any other behavior, if we move back and we start looking at where did this behavior come from? Why is it there? We can usually backtrack and find a reason why it all started. Mm-hmm. And then we can move forward. But if we don't fix these other things first, it doesn't matter how beautifully or how much, you know, how beautifully we present the food or how much fun the food is. If it doesn't feel good going down, we're not going to fix it.
Yeah, that's true.
So I just wanted to say something, you know, I understand from Barbara said about the 20 foods. Sometimes I have a little discomfort that because they could eat 20 crunchy things, and that's very limiting in itself, or 25 crunchy things. So
well, that's like I'm saying, that's only one category of food.
Right. So sometimes I also, one of the things we would look at is eliminating, and Barbara, you sort of mentioned that, is in terms of the food groups. If they're eliminating one food group completely, why is that? What is going on? Do we need to investigate? And I've certainly worked with children that are have eliminated a food group. Protein comes up very often, like the protein group, whether it's animal protein or vegetable protein. Sometimes if they're doing dairy foods, we've got enough protein, but we still want to widen the field a bit along the way. So we want to take a look at that. If they really have very selective eating about the types of foods that they will eat and the variety. And that's why, again, a team is really important to work together. We need to investigate. Barbara's absolutely correct. We need to go back and do that history, figure out how these, maybe we got there. We might be able to figure out where we are right now. So as a nutritionist, I like to know, so how are we doing? I mean, are we compromised and are not growing well? Barbara called it fail to thrive. I call fail to throw. That's a more immediate concern than a child that's growing, but just a very narrow field. And what do we need to do? So it's nice to have a nutrition evaluation as well as evaluation by the feeding people, know what's going on growth-wise. You need to get that information from a variety of sources and then develop a plan. And some people will be more involved with the family over time if it's needing to learn to eat or whatever that might be, versus nutrition might just check in periodically. But again, be aware of that team and working. So
team.
Parents should, look for that. That's a really important thing if they have questions. Yeah.
That's super important. We've talked about a lot of different team members between pediatrician, ENT, nutritionist, speech pathologist, occupational therapists, GI specialists, potentially behavior counselors. So there are a lot of people that can be involved in the team, and it's important that to know that there's a lot of support out there, I think, for our families. Barbara, do we need to let you go? Because I know you're on a shorter time frame than the rest of us.
I'm listening. It's making me go,
Well, we'll forgive you if you have to run off. We'll let you slide out. But
I hear voices. I gotta go, ladies.
Oh, thanks so much, Barbara. We so appreciated you. Bye. Wonderful. Well, good. Now we can wrap up a little. Jessica, did you have any other thoughts to share too on the value of the team or the team members that might be working with families if you've got a situation where your child is very limited or refusing to eat a variety of foods?
Yeah, I agree with what was already said. I think that the team approach is really important in all aspects, feeding or anything else. I think that when we as professionals talk to each other, even just as you've seen in this live broadcast, we've had different schools of thought coming from different places, but a lot of it crosses over and it comes together and it makes sense. And there's things Sharon knows that are her specialty areas. There's things Barbara knows that are her specialty areas. And again, some crosses over and some are completely like, I heard things today that I didn't know. And I really appreciated that as a learning therapist myself, you know, and you know, we talked about, you know, the variety of foods and how we restrict things. And sometimes that is a sensory thing too. And so having an occupational therapist come in and be a part of that to say, you know, they can chew, they can swallow, they can do all these things, but they're still restricting a lot of groups of foods. So let's think about why. And sometimes it's that sensation, it's the inside the mouth sensation. And we need to, you know, give them some increased input and information so they understand what's happening in their mouth and they know how to move the food. And it could be that their tongue is limited in movement and range, and that motor development, the tongue development moves with motor development. So if we have a child who's delayed in their movement, there's going to be some delays in their oral motor movement as well. And so that can make things just come along slower. But just all those little pieces that we each know separately that can bring to the table to say, have we thought about this? Because I think Barbara touched on it just a little bit, is that it's so important not to just say, you know, whether they're eating or not, but we're looking at how they're eating, what they're eating, and then when they're not, why. We really want to get to the bottom of why. And there's so many, as she's touched on just a few, and there's so many vast reasons why a child could experience difficulties with feeding and eating. And those are different categories. We have feeding, which is how we feed ourselves. And then we have eating, which is the process of chewing and swallowing and processing food. And so they're different categories.
Yes,
and they're talked about like they're the exact same thing, but they really are separate. We have a child could be eating, but not feeding themselves. And so it really is just all these people that have these amazing, you know, experiences of their own and knowledge to share. If we come together and we say, here's what's happening, you know, a lot of times we pull from our own experience. We say, I had a kid before that experienced that, and I think this was the problem. Let's just eliminate it. Let's just go through that process of elimination to see what we can say we know it's not, and then where we have a narrow focus of where we should start really putting more attention, and then bringing in those specialists as needed and as appropriate, because that's a whole nother topic and a whole nother show. But it can be difficult.
Versus eating.
Well, no, I mean, just it can be really difficult as a person working with someone, as a professional. And again, I can only do so much to encourage my families to move into other places to talk to their pediatrician. But when they go to their pediatrician and they're hitting a wall and they feel like they're not being heard, or they're not, and Sharon did say, if one person doesn't listen, go talk to somebody else. But that's difficult for families. They feel loyalty to their pediatricians. They feel like they're going to hurt their feelings if they talk to other people. And they sometimes feel like they just have to trust, or they just blindly trust what they're being told, even if it isn't always the best advice. And so I do really wish that there was this perfect teaming experience out there for everybody. But as individual therapists, we need to remind our families that they do have the authority in their children's lives, and they have the advocacy. They have to be an advocate. They have to say, you know, I'm not sure I agree with what you're saying, and I'm not trying to hurt your feelings or go against your professionalism, but I want another person to talk to about this, or I want to go to another source and just see. Because and I tell the parents all the time, they might be a doctor and they might be a, you know, whatever they are, but they don't know your child like you do. They don't know your child. You do. You're the professional when it comes to your kids. So when you have that gut feeling and you feel like something's not right, you know in your being that just doesn't seem right. And you need to go with that. You need to push through it as hard as it can be. You got to push through it, and finding those people in your network to support you in that is really big. And so that team, it just really provides more places for them to go for support, and even just to talk and to be heard if they're not getting what they feel like they need. So
that is such a great message for families. Do we know of resources like, I know in the beginning we mentioned a little bit about how like a family with a child on a feeding tube can sometimes get paired up or partnered with another family that's going through that so that they can provide a support network to each other. But do we have resources like that for people who maybe aren't so severe, but maybe their kid just isn't quite branching out beyond 20 foods, or isn't quite, maybe they have a baby that just is struggling with reflux and is struggling. Do we have groups for that type of thing?
Well, I think there are a variety of groups that are available. I know and so we're in Washington State here. Ostensibly, this is coming from Kitsap County. There's a parents of preemies group. Now, that means everything preemie, not just feeding kinds of things. So you want to think about that. I think now in Washington State, we've been working toward getting, especially if a baby's been born early, that they at least get connected with, we've talked about early intervention or birth to 3 centers, what they're called, and at least monitored for issues. And I think there you can work with that team and say, is there anybody else here I can talk to who's had an experience? The team member can go to that family and say, you had this experience with Susie. I have a family that's doing similar. Would you mind if I shared your information and, you could just talk? Sometimes that's just family to family. Barbara mentioned the feeding matters, and they kind of do that, somewhat connecting with them, but you might want somebody a little closer to home. Or birth to 3, as I mentioned, is a great resource for those with children birth at 3 years of age. But after 3, you're out the door, which is appropriate. And so then, what else is available?
Then you have to call us.
Yeah, right. So I think you need to work with therapists, and it's a broad topic to say there's one place to go for support. But if you're working with a team, wherever you're doing, even a therapist, they may be able to help guide you to someone that you might be able to share those experiences. And Jessica, I agree 100%. Children, and even I, who work with a family and may suggest something, and I'm sure you've had this experience where even they come back and say something we may have suggested didn't work. So we problem solve, because that's how we get to know the child and the family and what might work for them as an individual child and an individual family. So it's really important to listen to parents. They're part of the team too, if we haven't mentioned that.
The most important part of the team.
Yes.
Yeah, they're like the quarterback on the team.
That's right.
Just throw that football. Yeah. So, this was so wonderful. I think we covered a lot of information for families. Have we thoroughly killed pediatric feeding disorders yet?
Probably not.
There's so much out there.
So
it just is amazing to me. It's amazing how when you start diving into something, there's so many reasons why a child might struggle, and then you kind of have to look for those clues, and then address each piece of it one thing at a time.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Thank you, ladies, so much for joining us. I really, really love chatting with you and learning from you. You guys are such a wealth of information. One more time, we're going to point families back to the RAC card, the ICFQ RAC card, that we will post in our Facebook Live feed, so that if there's a family that maybe you have a friend, or maybe it's your neighbor, or maybe it's you, and you're not sure if your kid's a good eater or not, you can go through these 6 questions, and it'll give you a real good indicator of whether or not you should have a conversation with your pediatrician, or reach out to somebody at Holly Ridge or at Aubin Aphasia Center for a little extra support with your kiddo. So
absolutely.
Yes. Thank you.
And on that note, I just want to make sure people know, if they're listening and they don't know about Holly Ridge Center, it is an early intervention center, and parents can call and self-refer their children. So they don't have to have a referral from a physician to start. They can just call and say, I have some problems, I'm not sure. And they can go through a whole intake process that will then allow us to go and get those referrals so that we can do assessments if there's an issue.
And Holly Ridge is a nonprofit too, and they cover 100% of the services for all of the families that come to you, right? Right?
Well, yeah. So there is insurance billing, and there is sometimes things that are outside of that, but we will do everything we can to support a family if they need the financial help.
That's right. Yeah, Holly Ridge takes very good care of their families.
Well,
thank you so much, ladies. And I don't know when I'll see you again, but I hope it's not too far away. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.